Okay, yeah, welcome to my talk. So today I want to talk to you guys about cross-chain arbitrage. But first, maybe I want to start with, do we know even what an arbitrage is? So can you quickly raise a hand if you know what is an arbitrage? Okay, pretty good. So this is a latest paper that we wrote with colleagues from University of Lisbon, from Flashbots, and from Technical University of Munich. And I want to first start with some motivation about why do we even care about cross-chain arbitrage. So today, what happens is that most of the assets, they have price discovery, which happens on centralized exchanges. And this makes sense because the centralized exchanges like Binance, Coinbase, they have benefits which the decentralized exchange can't offer right now. Like they have much faster execution speed, they're usually cheaper, they have more liquidity, so you have a reason to trade on these platforms, and that's why for the major assets, the price discovery happens on them. But then, of course, we have those same assets usually on-chain as well, and because the prices are not in sync by default, someone has to then bring them into parity. So what this means is that maybe we have a WETH USD market, and then on a centralized exchange, the price is $4,000, and on the DEX, it's also $4,000. But then some big news happens, so the external market reacts to it. Maybe the price goes up, but the DEX price is still the same. So now someone can do an arbitrage, bring them into the parity, and then also profit from the difference between them. And this is how usually market efficiency is established on-chain as well. So the prices first get discovered on CEXes, and then they get reflected onto the decentralized exchange. But ideally, in a decentralized world where DeFi wins, what we will see is that the liquidity will live on-chain. So the assets will have their main liquidity source fragmented to different DEXs on different blockchains. And then this will require us arbitraging between in a cross-chain fashion so that we still have prices in parity, but now no centralized exchange is involved. And in this paper, we wanted to see if this is already happening as DeFi liquidity is growing over time. So we argue that these arbitrages can be done in two ways. One of them is by holding inventory on different blockchains. So this could be you hold, I don't know, Pepe on Arbitrum and Base, and then if the price on one chain simply goes up, you sell Pepe on the expensive one and then buy on the cheap one, and then you make a profit. The problem with this is that while you can make these trades simultaneously, which is one of the most important things for an arbitrage because you are racing against the others, or also noise trades, this is costly because you don't know that Pepe will have an opportunity like this in the future. So you have to hold this inventory, and of course holding inventory has cost because maybe someone will rug pull that token, so the token will have no value, and then you will be left with this worthless tokens. So while it's fast and you probably make more profits, ideally, it's also risky. The other option is, because blockchain interoperability is evolving, we have now Bridge, which will simply allow you to do one leg, get the output, bridge them to another chain, and then complete the arbitrage. This is all good because now you're not really taking risk and buying some assets on different chains and holding them until an opportunity comes up. But the problem with this is then that you have to go through the bridging time, which, for example, in an Ethereum Polygon native bridge case, it can take 20-25 minutes, which is a crazy long time for an arbitrage, which in traditional finance, you try to cut off milliseconds to be the winning one. So this is a cheaper strategy, more accessible, but a slower one. And we show in the paper that based on some conditions, such as the bridging time, how often the opportunities comes up, and what is in general the price drift of the token, we can find the conditions whether you should hold the assets on different chains, so hold inventory or use a bridge. And of course, you can expect, with increasing bridging time, for example, you go closer, holding inventory is more profitable. And if, for example, the opportunities are not coming up super frequently, then you probably shouldn't hold inventory. But this part is less fun. The more fun is actually looking into empirical data, so looking into whether these cross-chain arbitrages are happening in the wild. So I briefly want to tell you guys about how you can actually detect this, because when you think about it, this is so far like no study was really done on this because it's quite complex to identify, because you simply take one, for example, Ethereum transaction and then claim that, oh, this is related to this Arbitrum transaction done by this entity, but actually there's like no on-chain evidence that they are connected. So how do we then identify that they're actually belonging to the same strategy? So we introduced 4 heuristics and tested it on some sample data to reach a confidence level. The first one is a classic heuristic for any kind of like cyclic arbitrage, which is to say the 2 transactions, or like 2 swaps in an atomic arbitrage case, simply trade the same tokens. So for example, if we have 2 transactions in this case, one of them is on Arbitrum and the other one is on Base, we see that the Arbitrum one is selling WETH for buying this OmniCat token, and then the Base one is selling OmniCat for buying WETH. And when you match them, it's a classic cyclic arbitrage. So this is the first heuristic that we apply. The second one is that, of course, their amounts shouldn't be super different than each other, especially not the profit one, but the other asset, which you ideally stay neutral, should not diverge more than a threshold that we found to be like 0.5%. So in this case, the trader is selling 0.9 WETH for 1.03 million Omni on Arbitrum, and then selling the same amount of Omni to make 1 WETH, then profit like 0.1 WETH on Base. So we check this marginal difference between the 2 transactions. The third one is, of course, there must be a reasonable time between them. So like we cannot say, oh, this transaction from 2019 is associated with this transaction from 2025 and they make an arbitrage. This doesn't work. So usually this time difference is going to be in milliseconds in traditional finance. Of course, in blockchains we have block times, which introduce some gap anyway. So we here introduce like 2 different heuristics. If it's like a major token pair, which will also be traded on a centralized exchange, we apply a much stricter window, and otherwise we apply like a little more relaxed window, which will still then be limited by the other heuristics. And then the final thing is, which leads to us to like only come up with some lower bound numbers, is that we require the entities to be linked somehow. So this can be that they either have the same EOA address conducting the transactions, or the contract that they touch first is an MEV contract. And we check that it's an MEV contract by checking that it's not a contract that we know what it is doing. So it's not a DeFi contract, like a Uniswap contract or anything, because then like there's no way that the same guy is owning that contract. So we look if it's the same entity, either from the same EOA or touching the same bot contract doing the transactions. And then when we apply this on a data set from September 2023 to August 2024 on 9 different blockchains, we get these numbers. So the total traded volume in this 1-year period is around 686 million, which is, compared to like centralized exchange activity, is not a huge number. But thinking that like cross-chain activity is actually gaining traction over time, it shows that, okay, like this can become a reality over time. And we see that after the Denkun upgrade on Ethereum, things actually started picking up because Denkun simply lowered the transaction fees on these rollups, which then enabled like these traders to do like more profitable trades. And then we see that most of the activity, like most of the volume passes through Ethereum, which again makes sense because like for most tokens, the liquidity resides on Ethereum. So if you want to do like a profitable arbitrage with high volume, you usually have to touch upon Ethereum. The other thing we see is, of course, that this is like an expected result, but these arbitrage opportunities come up because usually like if it's like a token traded on a centralized exchange, well, then something has to happen on a centralized exchange, which will then trickle down to on-chain as well. And like if we look into the volatility of like major assets like Ethereum or Bitcoin on centralized exchange, we see that there's a positive correlation with their volatility and the on-chain cross-chain arbitrage volume. So even though like the assets traded for cross-chain arbitrage could be like meme coins and so on, still you see these second-order effects of these volatility on major tokens to these meme coins. perhaps the most interesting thing is about the execution of these arbitrages. So first, I introduced that these arbitrages can be done in two ways, and we looked into how actually they were executed in real life, and we saw that like 67% of them took the inventory away, and then only the remaining 23%, 33% did the bridge arbitrage. For the bridge arbitrage, we also looked if they picked up a native bridge that the blockchains offered naturally, or like a third-party bridge, which we call a multi-chain bridge, because usually those bridges like don't operate only between two chains. And we see that like the inventory arbitrage more dominant in general, and there is a reason, because we see that they settle in 9 seconds on average, which is fine when considering the block times. But for example, for the bridge arbitrage, the average time is around 240 seconds, like 6 minutes, and especially for the native ones, it's 1,020 seconds, so around 18 minutes. And most of them are caused by the Ethereum Polygon arbitrage. The interesting thing here is that like if you told any trader that it will take like 18 minutes for you to settle an arbitrage, probably they would say like you're kidding, because this would never happen in traditional finance. And in fact, we still see that like most of the arbitrage which use a bridge on blockchains take this native bridge, which then takes a super long time, and yet still it's a profitable strategy. Like this hints that like DeFi is still not there yet. Like if these are more efficient markets, you would ideally have these market makers or traders which have inventory on both sides, so they wouldn't require a 20-minute bridge, and yet still today it's viable to adopt such a bridge and conduct such an arbitrage. Finally, we looked into who is doing these arbitrages, and we found that as it's happening in many other markets on-chain, also off-chain, I guess, it's heavily concentrated. 50% of the transactions are done by 5 entities only, and again, 50% of the volume is traded by 4 searchers. But what's even more concerning is that there's a single entity which after Denkun traded like 40% single-handedly, and overall again traded like 1/4 of the whole trades. And you can also see that again, this entity is picking up speed over time, which is dangerous because MEV in general, we know that like the parties who can extract it has an advantage in different parts of the ecosystem. So in this case, if it's like a trader who is like making more money than everyone else, it's not a huge deal. But if this trader decides to like make a deal with a sequencer of a chain, for example, then things can become scary, because then they will be vertically integrated, and then simply they can like take out all the money, which the others can't, because if I'm sequencing the chains which I want to do an arbitrage on, then I'm in the best position. So that's what we finally raised in the paper as a concern. We think that cross-chain arbitrage is not like the most prominent MEV avenue right now, but over time as DeFi picks up, we think it can become like prominent source of value in blockchains, and yet their execution is not trivial. So either you have to hold this inventory, which is a tricky thing that only probably like trading shops can do, or you have to go through these really slow bridges, which risk the execution of your strategies. And we think right now, like those expert trading shops, like the high-frequency trading shops, which are already active on Ethereum and running their own block builders, can then have similar deals with sequencers of rollups or like staking providers, so that they now both control the sequencing of the chains, but then they also know how to manage money, so then they can do these cross-chain arbitrage. And this will then lead to a world where the infrastructure is concentrated like even more than it is today, and this in general would go against all the decentralization ethos of the blockchains that we want to establish, because if the physical infra is concentrated, then this will be against the geographical decentralization, and simply all the infra that say like runs the meaningful economic activity of a blockchain would be under same jurisdiction, which then again go through like sanctions and enforce censorship on blockchains. So it's super risky. And to address these issues, we think block building should be decentralized. There shouldn't be singular entities who are sequencing chains or simply has the only right to like decide which transactions go into the blockchain. This could somehow fight against this issue that like a single sequencer running a trading shop decides like who extract this cross-chain MEV. But then we also think that with better interoperability solutions, like faster bridge, more seamless bridging in general, these arbitrage opportunities can be extracted by like not only sophisticated parties, but also like newcomers can enter the market and simply break this feedback loop of like rich gets richer, and if you sequence, you can get more MEV, and with your expertise, then you can sequence more chains, and this becomes a chicken and egg problem that we see across many markets on blockchain ecosystem. And you can find the preprint of the paper, a blog post on the methodology, and a sample repo with example cross-chain arbitrage to play around. And maybe as a final note, so as you may have noticed, this data is quite old now, so we continued collecting new data. Unfortunately, I couldn't put the latest picture here, but at the end of, or mid-January 2025, this volume is now 1.5 billion, and actually cross-chain activity relatively skyrocketed after November this year, last year. I don't know why yet, but I will figure it out. And we actually found out like the highest cross-chain arbitrage profit so far, which was a 50 ETH arbitrage between Arbitrum and Base, which happened in 25 seconds, which is a substantial amount for an on-chain, cross-chain activity. And I think we're going to see more of this in the upcoming future. And that's going to be all for now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any question?
Do you have any data on like which tokens are mostly being like used in this hub, like the cross-chain hub?
Yes. So the tokens used on for cross-chain arbitrage, they are usually these meme tokens. For example, like I showed Omni because Omni was one of them. It gets listed on decentralized exchange, I think in December 20th or something in 2023. And for 5 days, you see this super high peak of cross-chain activity. But a week later, it gets listed on a centralized exchange and all the activity dies. Because then you have no incentive to really cross-chain arbitrage them. You arbitrage them against a centralized exchange, which offers you more liquidity, lower fees, faster execution, and so on. But we also see some activity on wrapped Bitcoin pair because you can actually take a loan for that on chain, and this actually enables you to do cross-chain arbitrage with like less inventory.
Yeah, quick question. So you mentioned like fast bridges will be beneficial for that, and I was wondering, are they using like the current ones? Are they using like fast bridges? Because from my current understanding, a lot of like between L2's fast bridges are liquidity bridges that are centralized, and was wondering if they have the trust in those systems. I was thinking that would be interesting.
I think like they're using layer 0 and layer 0 built bridge mostly, which depending on the chain pair brings you some time advantage, but still it's not great.
That's it, right? Okay, thanks a lot.